Hi, everybody. Brad Truax from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And this morning we're going to talk about woodpeckers. You've all heard that wonderful sound. Often it's one of the first sounds we hear in spring, and it virtually echoes throughout the forest. Well, the impetus for today's presentation was actually a photo taken by Bob Herrick. He took this photo on the 17th hole at Eastman's golf course. And of course, what you're seeing here, these holes are classic pileated woodpecker holes. Whereas most woodpeckers leave round holes, the pileated woodpecker leaves rectangular holes. So here you see a nice rectangle, nice one there. So that was the reason we decided to do this video at this time. There are 23 species of woodpeckers in North America, but we only have 9 here in New Hampshire, and not all of them are here year round. Woodpeckers, of course, are known for drilling into trees, searching for insects, but the cavities that they leave in the trees serve as nests, not just for the woodpeckers themselves, but they're also used by many other birds, bats, and small mammals. Woodpeckers don't just eat insects, they also eat nuts, seeds, and fruit. And some species, like sapsuckers, even feed on the sap of trees. And the drumming sound of woodpeckers is unmistakable, but they have other vocalizations as well. And later on, you're going to hear about both the drumming sounds and the vocalizations. So, again, that drumming sound of woodpeckers, even though it's unmistakable, it's not what you think. It's not about digging for food. Actually, when they're looking for food or eating, they just peck relatively quietly and softly. The loud, prolonged drumming that you hear is actually a means of communication. It may be advertising for a mate or simply stating, hey, this is my territory. And they like to drum on things that amplify sound, so particularly hollow trees or even metal posts or the siding of a house. And woodpeckers do have other vocalizations that communicate as well. So here are those 9 woodpeckers that we see in New Hampshire. We'll talk briefly about each of them, but we'll spend most of our time with the pileated woodpecker. Well, the pileated woodpecker is the largest woodpecker in North America. It's about the size of a crow and might be up to 19 inches long, has this characteristic red crest. That's where it gets its name from. And the wingspan may be up to 30 inches. That's pretty impressive for a small bird. Again, pileated means capped, crowned, or crested. So it's named after the striking red crest that kind of looks like a mohawk haircut. And again, as I mentioned before, the pileated woodpecker leaves these distinctive rectangular deep holes in trees while it's looking for insects and ants and other insects. So again, you can tell a male and a female pileated woodpecker apart by the red crest. Okay, and the top, you're seeing a male pileated woodpecker. And you can see that the red crest actually begins right at the base of the beak and goes all the way back. Also, if you look carefully, you see this little red stripe. That's called a malar stripe. Some people have called it a mustache. That's only on the male. So here's the female. Here, the red crest begins about halfway back on the head. And notice there's no red stripe here. So that's how you tell a male and a female pileated woodpecker apart. So the male's red crest actually plays a role in attracting a mate or in asserting dominance. Okay, so on the top, you see that while this woodpecker is searching for insects, doing work, basically the red crest is pretty flat, almost looks like it's hair combed back. Okay, but down here at the bottom, look at the red crest. Here it's spiked up. So perhaps this one is either trying to intimidate a foe or trying to attract a mate. The male and female nest inside one of the cavities that they've created, and they don't need any other nesting materials. And they only use that nesting site for 1 year. And unfortunately, in the future, other birds or small mammals may use that site for nesting. So that's a huge contribution to the ecology of the forest and promotes diversity in the forest. So again, Terry Munson from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee actually shot this shot of a pileated woodpecker here at Eastman. Here you can see the pileated woodpecker on a tree. And down here, you see the really extensive cavities that were left by that woodpecker. She also got a video of that pileated woodpecker. So let's watch that. This tree must have lots of ants or larvae. Okay, and obviously this video did not have any sound, but I did check with Terry, and there was actually very little sound coming from that woodpecker pecking on that tree. And that goes back to what I said before, that usually when they're at work, the pecking is usually pretty quiet. The loud drumming sound that we hear is communication rather than the woodpecker at work. So again, the pileated woodpeckers are very territorial, and they'll defend their territory from other woodpeckers or other intruders. They typically have a range of about 150 to 200 acres for enough for themselves and for their family. So you probably won't see many in one small area. But here at Eastman, we have over 3,600 acres. So you have a pretty good chance of seeing a pileated woodpecker here at Eastman. And they also don't migrate, so you might even see one here in winter, perhaps at your bird feeder. So again, I said before, most woodpeckers leave round holes in trees, but not the pileated woodpecker. They leave these rectangular holes, often huge ones like these in this photo. And they can actually cut a small tree in half with their pecking. They have a preference for deciduous trees, especially ones that are dead or dying. And that's because those trees are easier to excavate and they tend to have more insects in them. But they'll also tear apart stumps and big sections of fallen logs to find insects. So here's one that actually found a fallen birch tree, and it's rotting, so it probably has lots of insects in it. And what are they looking for? They're especially prefer those dead dying trees because they have lots of insects. And they like carpenter ants and beetle larvae. So here on top, you see the carpenter ants. Down here, you see the beetle larvae. And those are things that they're especially looking for inside those dead dying trees. So again, the carpenter ants usually live in tunnels inside a tree. So here you see a bunch of carpenter ants inside a tunnel, inside a tree. And the pileated woodpecker excavates a hole to get into that tunnel and then reaches in with its long, sticky, barbed tongue to basically slurp up those ants. In the bottom, it wasn't hard to tell that this tree had carpenter ants because you see all the sawdust at the bottom. Clearly, much of the sawdust was from the carpenter ants, and a whole bunch of it was actually from the pileated woodpecker excavating these holes in this tree. So woodpeckers actually love trees that are EAB infested. An early sign of the emerald ash borer infestation may be increased woodpecker activity. And woodpeckers can sense the presence of the emerald ash borer larvae in ash trees. So here you see one that's basically attacking an ash tree that is infected by the emerald ash borer. So again, they use their long beaks to excavate the wood, looking for those ants or beetle larvae or other insects. And their pecking actually accelerates the demise of dead and dying trees, so it eventually restores nutrients to the soil. And they can peck up to 12,000 times a day. They can even peck at a rate of 15 to 20 per second. So why don't they get concussions? You or I, if we were banging our heads against trees or any immovable objects, we'd get concussions or brain contusions. So how do woodpeckers do it and not get concussions? Well, human brains slosh around inside our hard skulls. They actually are kind of the consistency of a bowl of jello. And particularly when the skull shakes, or particularly when it rotates, that jello-like brain gets pushed up against the hard skull, and can get damaged in that way. Well, the woodpeckers, on the other hand, have very small brains that fit very tightly in their skull. So there's actually very little sloshing that goes around. And they have a long, specialized hyoid bone that actually wraps around the back of the skull and almost acts like a seat belt to stabilize the head. And it used to be thought that a porous, spongy bone at both the front and the back of the skull might absorb some of the energy, but that's probably not the case. And also the specific consistent angles that they use to strike the trees minimizes the rotational forces that leads to concussions and contusions in humans. So how do woodpeckers stand on trees? Well, first of all, most woodpeckers have four toes, two that point forward and two backward. Here's two toes going forward, two backward. And they plant those trees on the bark of a tree, and then they use fairly stiff tails to form a tripod with those toe holds. So here you see the yeah, toes are up here, tail down here. Same thing over here. Toes up here, tail down here, and it's forming a tripod. And that gives them the stability to peck holes in trees or look for insects or to drum. And they actually prefer hopping around trees to flying. In that video that Terry Munson did that we showed earlier, you kind of saw the woodpecker kind of hopping around the back of the tree. So pileated wood, the drumming sound of the pileated woodpecker is really unmistakable. And that drumming sound, as we said before, is not part of their usual work. It's really a communication tool. And it's used to communicate with other woodpeckers and mark their territory. And they'll often choose a hollow tree to do that drumming. And that amplifies the sound. So that sound really carries over long distances. So sometimes when you're out hiking in the woods and you can hear the sound of a woodpecker drumming, that woodpecker may be hundreds of yards away, maybe even farther. So we're going to listen to some of those sounds. The drumming sound, again, is a communication sound. Sorry, we're first getting the piping sound, but now let's hear the drumming sound. And here's the piping sound again. Okay, so two ways that the pileated woodpecker communicates. So again, the pileated woodpeckers usually mate for life, and the nest is in one of those cavities that they dug in the tree. And the male and the female take turns feeding the young. Here you actually see a male pileated woodpecker, remember, because the red crest starts at the back of the beak, and they have this red malar stripe. So this male woodpecker is feeding the young. And they use that nest only for 1 year. And then that nest will be subsequently probably used by either other birds or other small mammals or maybe bats. And because that nest is used by so many other animals, some have referred to the pileated woodpecker as a keystone species. You remember in some of our other presentations, when we talk about a keystone species, that means that if that particular either tree or wildlife species is removed, it has detrimental effects on the entire ecology. So quite frankly, they probably do, the pileated woodpecker probably does meet the definition of a keystone species. Very interesting. And of course, the most famous woodpecker of all was Woody Woodpecker. Woody Woodpecker was the cartoon character created by Walter Lantz. And Woody Woodpecker was actually modeled on a pileated woodpecker. So here you see that red crest up there. So enough about the pileated woodpecker. The red-headed woodpecker obviously gets its name from its bright red head. And it's actually the only woodpecker with an entirely red head. And it's a medium-sized bird, probably about the size of a robin. and its belly is white, and the wings are dark gray or black, but you have these white patches on the back. So pretty distinctive. It's actually a beautiful bird. So the red-headed woodpeckers are omnivores. They eat both plants and insects, fruits and nuts, sometimes even bird eggs. And they spend most of their time foraging for food, and they may cache their food in crevices in the trees or holes in the trees for consuming later on. They catch insects either by tapping on the trees or finding them on the ground, or even them catching them midair in flight. It's one of the few woodpeckers that actually captures insects in flight. Their favorite foods, though, are nuts and acorns, nuts like acorns and beech nuts. And they make their homes in dead trees or utility poles, and they often use the holes that were left by other woodpeckers, like the pileated woodpecker. They do migrate south in winter, but if they see a bumper crop of acorns or beech nuts, they may stock up on them and linger longer in the north, and they might even stay for the winter. So again, here's a red-headed woodpecker, and we're going to see maybe it catches an insect out of the air. There he's flying around, probably grabbing an insect. Okay, it's not just squirrels that cache nuts. Here's on the top, a red-headed woodpecker that's caching a nut for the winter. Blue jays are also known to cache nuts. And extremely important that the caching of nuts by birds rather than squirrels is probably a very important way that oak trees are propagated. If you think about it, if you have an oak tree and the acorns fall out of the oak tree, there's actually very little chance that they're going to germinate and eventually turn into another oak tree right under that big oak tree that's already there. But what happens is that the birds will grab these acorns and fly away. They may fly a mile away or something like that. And they drop some of those acorns, they lose them. And it's those acorns that get lost that may eventually germinate into beautiful oak trees. And once again, starting that famous cycle of the oak and the acorns, what we talk about in so many of our presentations. So again, here you see a beautiful red-headed woodpecker that's flying off with some sort of a nut in its mouth. So again, when we said that the red-headed woodpecker loves fruits and nuts, it'll often wedge those seeds and nuts like acorns into the crevices of the bark of a tree. And they'll often cover them with loose material to actually hide them from other birds. And then they'll hammer on that nut to break the nut open and get the actual nut from the inside. They'll often use the stump or the top of a dead tree as a chopping block to crack open those nuts. So let's see if we get one here.
Your biggest fear came true. Your beloved pet is suddenly missing. Luckily, you have...
There you see a red-headed woodpecker chopping open a nut using the top of the tree. Okay, on the other hand, the red-bellied woodpecker is amazing. That little tiny red splotch gives it its name. And that's probably because the red-headed woodpecker already took the name of red-headed. So the red-bellied woodpeckers are medium-sized birds, and they have a long tongue. They can stick that sticky tongue out 2 inches beyond their beak to capture insects. So again, the red-bellied woodpecker is relatively new to New Hampshire. Really only started appearing around 2000, but it increased in numbers since 2020. And most people have attributed that to the emerald ash borer infestation. Remember, we said that woodpeckers are very good at sensing the presence of the emerald ash borer larvae in the trees. And sometimes the first indication that we have emerald ash borer infestation is that the woodpecker activity is increased. But for the red-bellied woodpecker, insects only make up less than half of its diet, and the remainder is composed of fruit, nuts, seeds, nectar, and sometimes even small vertebrates, lizards, tree frogs, nesting birds. And it's one of the birds that can eat both acorns and pine cones. And they'll sometimes wedge large nuts into tree crevices and then break them apart with their beaks. If you want to see red-bellied woodpeckers building nests, go to the Naturally Curious website, and there's a very nice article there on their nesting activities. And like the red-headed woodpecker, the red-bellied woodpecker migrates south in the winter. So they love nuts. Here's one that actually has a peanut. And again, let's watch this video. This is a red-bellied woodpecker that's breaking open, using the nub of a branch to crack open a nut. Okay, the top one got a walnut. Okay, and the bottom one, he actually had a peanut that was wedged in a crevice in this tree, and actually got that peanut out of the shell of the peanut. Okay, another actually beautiful bird is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. This is a medium-sized woodpecker, but it's very colorful. Not only does it have red, black, and white, but it's also got the yellow belly that gives it its name. And it's somewhat unique in that its primary food source is sap. Okay, and aside from sap, it will feed on arthropods, fruit, nuts, and buds. And it leaves very unmistakable marks on trees, very signature that it leaves on trees. So again, it's unique because sap is its primary food source. And they prefer tree species that have a high sugar content and thin bark and high sap flow. So particularly birch trees, but also some maples, aspens, and some fruit trees. And they often leave behind these signature horizontal rows of tiny holes. We'll show you a picture of those in a minute. And leaking from some of the sap wells that the sapsucker leaves becomes a critical food source for hummingbirds, squirrels, butterflies, and other insects. But sometimes the sapsuckers are considered to be pests, and that's because they can actually kill the tree by, quote, girding it. We'll show you a picture in a minute. And the sapsuckers do have several vocalizations, but the sapsucker drums on materials that reverberate loudly, similar to what we saw with the pileated woodpecker. And we'll listen to that later on. So here's a unique drumming pattern that they have. Okay, so again, I mentioned before that they especially like birch trees, and that's because birch trees have a thin bark and a very sweet sap. So the sap that drips from these wells that they leave, and I mentioned, can be a food source for squirrels and hummingbirds and butterflies and other insects. And sapsuckers can actually kill a tree by girding it. We'll show you a picture in a minute. But these rows of tiny holes spread out horizontally are signatures of the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So here you see that rows of tiny holes around this tree. But again, they can actually kill a tree by girding it. Look at this birch tree that's basically been probably killed by girding by a yellow-bellied sapsucker. Okay, next is the downy woodpecker. This is the smallest woodpecker in North America. It's a little guy. It may weigh less than an ounce. And it does have a very small red patch on the back of its head. But they can eat foods that larger woodpeckers can't get to, such as insects that are living on stems or stalks of weeds. So here you see one, how small it is, and it's actually able to go on this stalk where a larger woodpecker would not be able to stay. So you might see them at your bird feeder, or you might see them out hammering at goldenrod galls, and they're trying to extract the fly larvae that are inside those galls. So the downy woodpecker is often seen at backyard feeders or in parks, and they often mingle with other birds like chickadees or nuthatches, and you may see them in a group of those birds around your bird feeder. And you might also see them on those plant galls or suet feeders. And they can eat foods, again, that larger woodpeckers can't reach, such as those on stems or stalks of weeds. And they'll forage on trees for insects, bark beetles, caterpillars, and ants, but they may also eat seeds and berries. And they'll remain with those mixed bird species even in the winter. The hairy woodpecker is somewhat similar in appearance to the downy woodpecker, but it's actually bigger than the downy woodpecker. And it's mainly black. It doesn't have that little red spot that the downy woodpecker had. And the hairy woodpecker, again, is another frequent visitor to those backyard feeders. And once again, it's often confused with the downy woodpecker, but it's bigger than the downy woodpecker. And they eat mainly insects, but they'll also eat fruit, berries, nuts, and even sometimes tree sap. And especially the larvae of wood-boring beetles and bark beetles are favorites of theirs. So they'll also like the suet and sunflower seeds that you put in your bird feeders. And they like a whole bunch of various habitats, but they're especially attracted to recently burned forests that have dead trees. And that's probably because some of those wood-boring beetles that are their favorites are located in recently burned forests. The northern flicker is a little bit bigger woodpecker. It's actually the most widespread woodpecker species in North America, and it may weigh up to about 6 ounces. It's mostly brown with some black spots and bars, and it's unique in that it's probably the one woodpecker that spends most of its time foraging on the ground for insects as opposed to in trees. And there you see one down on the ground looking probably for some ants. So really it's the only woodpecker that forages mainly on the ground. They'll also dig into the soil and the leaf litter with their beaks, looking for ants. But they'll also eat fruits, berries, nuts, even though their primary food is insects. And ants alone actually make up about half of their diet. They'll also eat flies, butterflies, moths, beetles, and snails. The black-backed woodpecker is a medium-sized woodpecker. And again, it's got a black head, black back, tail is black. It's got some white outer feathers. And again, may have this little yellow spot up on the top. And unlike most woodpeckers, they only have 3 toes. Remember I said that most woodpeckers have 4 toes, 2 going forward and 2 going backward. Well, here we'll see a little bit better in the next picture. The black-backed woodpecker only has 3 toes. And again, they like burnt forests. So again, they have this penchant for burnt forests. And they'll seek out the larvae of the wood-boring beetles that feed on the trees in those burnt forests. So here, this woodpecker has this yellow larva of a wood-boring beetle that he got in a burnt-out tree. And again, if you look here, there's only 3 toes on this woodpecker. That's unusual for a woodpecker. And of course, the last woodpecker is the 3-toed woodpecker. This is a medium-sized one. You're probably not going to see it here in New Hampshire. It's pretty rare here. But once again, here you see it's got only 3 toes. So again, we've often talked about the beaks of the woodpeckers. We know they have these long, hard beaks, but their tongues are very important tools. And some have tongues that can stretch out 2 inches beyond their beaks, actually up to 1/3 of their body length in some cases. And those tongues are both sticky and barbed. And those features make it easy for them to extract insects and larvae from deep inside trees. So if you have a tongue that's 2 inches longer than your beak, it may not fit in your mouth. Okay, so here's a unique kind of way that they have of wrapping their tongue around their skull via the hyoid bone. So again, this is showing that they can thrust their tongue outward and then it snaps back, almost like that coiled tape measure that you use. So again, here's their tongue sticking way out, and now it's retracted and it's actually wrapped around their head. So very important. The woodpecker tongue is extremely important. So how about woodpecker drumming? Again, we've said that the drumming is used as a means of communication. It can be used to attract a mate or declare a territory. And the drumming might also make the insects move. That may be good or bad. It may make them move so that the woodpecker knows there's insects inside, but it may also chase some of those insects deeper into the tree. But let's look at Cornell Labs all about birds video on drumming because you'll hear some great sound. Pretty impressive drumming. Okay, but I know that all you bird watchers out there, you're very good at identifying birds by their sounds, even though you can't see them. So even though we're more familiar with the drumming of the woodpecker, let's listen to the sounds that are commonly heard from some of these common woodpeckers. We'll have to put up with a little commercial first, but it's worth waiting.
Simparica Trio protects against 3 categories of parasites.
Power disease.
This drug class has been associated with neurologic side effects, including seizures. Use with caution in dogs with or without a history of these disorders. Don't just protect, triple protect.
First up, we have the small and adorable downy woodpecker, which makes a whinny call, along with a short pick call. The similar-looking hairy woodpecker, which is larger overall and also has a longer bill, makes a rattle call, as well as a single-note peak call, which is sharper and slightly lower pitched compared to the pick of the downy. The red-bellied woodpecker, which doesn't have much of a red belly, makes a series of chirr or cha notes, as well as a rolling chirr call that is reminiscent of science fiction laser fire. The red-headed woodpecker makes a sharp chirr call, similar to the red-bellied woodpecker, but higher in pitch. Red-headed woodpeckers will also make loud char-char notes, which are normally heard when these birds chase each other around. In the spring, when northern flickers are establishing territory, they have a loud rolling rattle call that varies in volume. They also make a sharp clear or keer call note. The pileated woodpecker, which is the largest woodpecker you'll see in your backyard, makes a series of piping calls, similar to the northern flicker's rattling call, but it has a more variable tone, usually reverberates more, and changes rhythm more often, compared to the northern flicker call. The yellow-bellied sapsucker makes a mewing noise that is normally repeated more than once, as well as a repeated kwee-ah noise. The kwee-ah vocalization is normally heard during the breeding season or when birds are announcing their territorial boundaries. Have you seen or heard any of these woodpeckers in your yard? Let us know in the comments below. And thanks.
Okay, very interesting sounds. Okay, so what's the role of the woodpecker in the ecosystem? They're obviously very important. Again, they provide some natural pest control by eating insects that might be damaging trees, like the ants and the wood-boring beetles. And by removing insects, they can keep live trees healthy, but they also expedite return of nutrients from dead and dying trees into the soil. And as before, we mentioned they create these cavities that serve as nesting sites, not just for themselves, but for many small birds, small mammals, and others in the future. And that helps increase the diversity of the forest by providing homes for cavity dwelling birds, bats, and small mammals. And again, we mentioned before, caching nuts like acorns can actually help those acorns eventually germinate into valuable oak trees. And the leaking sap from the sapsucker sap wells becomes a critical food source for hummingbirds and butterflies and squirrels. And most of all, they're fascinating to watch too. So that's a bit about woodpeckers. We hope that you've gotten something out of this, and we hope you'll come back again.